The House will now proceed to the consideration of a motion to adjourn the House for the purpose of discussing a specific and important matter requiring urgent consideration, namely the fisheries in Nova Scotia. Accordingly, the motion is as follows. And do we have the seconder? Seconder is online? Not yet? Okay. Mr. Johns, seconded by Mr. Boulouris, moves that this House do now adjourn. Debate. The honourable member, by video conference, the honourable member for Courtenay Alberni.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to thank you for honouring our request to have this very important debate tonight to address the government's lackluster response to this crisis that's taking place in Mi'kmaq territory. As parliamentarians, we must take immediate action to keep Mi'kmaq fishers and their communities safe from the ongoing threats and acts of violence that are happening there. We must ensure the federal government is taking immediate action to provide justice for the Mi'kmaq victims of violence.
Reprise du débat, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'll be dividing my time with the Member of Parliament for West Nova, who has been thoughtfully raising this issue for months, Mr. Speaker, and that could have helped avoid an emergency debate if we'd had a government that was more seized with this issue, Mr. Speaker. Let me be clear off the top about two distinct issues, Mr. Speaker. Burning down buildings, that's always a crime, always. Destroying property is a crime, always. Whoever commits crime should be held accountable under the law. Je le répète.
I repeat, he or she that commits a crime must be punished by the law.
Second point I'd like to make, Mr. Speaker, the very fact that the government joined an opposition party that was going to raise this emergency debate is a sign they're calling for an emergency after 5 years of their own inaction on this issue, Mr. Speaker. It's quite unusual for a government to call for an emergency debate on a domestic issue that they've had carriage of for 5 years, Mr. Speaker. In fact, we tried to get research done on this point, and I think, but I can't be sure, it's never happened. Usually emergency debates would be called with respect to international issues that the government isn't able to lead on. But with this government, there's rarely leadership, Mr. Speaker. The Marshall Supreme Court decisions from the Supreme Court of Canada, and there are two, Mr. Speaker. Many Canadians may not know that. Many members of this House may not know there's two. Affirmed the right of First Nation communities to earn a moderate livelihood from the fishery. But it also affirmed the Canadian rules related to conservation and the system around regulation were to be respected as well. The Aboriginal right is paramount, Mr. Speaker. In our Constitution, in our duty to reconciliation, it is critical, Mr. Speaker. And in the 21 years since Marshall, there have been governments of many stripes that haven't been able to get this right, Mr. Speaker. But when fishing is happening out of season, or when we don't have a properly regulated season and regulatory process for a fishery, that can deteriorate the stocks and deteriorate the economic potential of the region, non-Indigenous and Indigenous. And right now, what's interesting, Mr. Speaker, is the sides of this debate, the Indigenous community and the non-Indigenous community, agree on one thing. The inaction of this government is unacceptable. We've had some suggesting that a peacekeeping operation is needed, Mr. Speaker, and that should tell you that the situation is troubling. Everyone involved in this issue deserves the respect and attention of their government, and it is the Liberals' inaction on this that has led to escalating tension and violence.
Unfortunately, tensions in Nova Scotia show the dangers of a government that is scared of making decisions, a government that simply hopes that problems will simply evaporate, a government that simply waits. However, the situation that pits the Mi'kmaq against commercial fishers is not something that simply popped up overnight. This is not a conflict that will simply evaporate through waiting for it to go away. This is a debate that needs to have both communities around the same negotiating table. Finding a compromise is part of our Canadian values.
Parliament even met, Mr. Speaker. Before I had the honour of taking my seat as the leader of Canada's founding party, over a month ago, on September 18th, I raised this issue personally with the Prime Minister because for months, my colleague from West Nova, other Canadians, Indigenous leaders, the commercial fishery and union leaders have been raising concerns about rising tensions, which is why I raised it directly with the Prime Minister. I asked his fisheries minister to mediate and exercise political courage. Tonight, she's asking for an emergency debate for a dispute in her own province under her watch that she's done nothing about for a year. No wonder there's frustrations in all of Canada, but particularly in Atlantic Canada. For weeks, members on this side of the House have been sounding notice and caution and asked the Liberal government to act. We've asked questions more than 7 times in the House, Mr. Speaker, and dozens of times in the media. We had to do that because for months, this government has preferred to sit back and wait, hoping the problem might go away by itself. Sadly, much like we're seeing now with the second wave of the pandemic, Mr. Speaker, these things don't go away. They require leadership. And we have a government that prefers photo ops over follow-ups, hashtags over real work. Hoping that problems will go away is not leadership, Mr. Speaker. The Minister of Fisheries herself let the situation escalate, and that has led to the tensions we see in recent days. Today, her inaction led to a press conference where not one but 2 of the 4 ministers were present to acknowledge that they let a situation spiral out of control. Rather than getting people to the table, they're agreeing with another opposition party that there's an emergency that they helped create, Mr. Speaker. A sad expression of leadership by a government. Liberals have preferred to also brand this dispute, and we heard this with the Prime Minister tonight, as entirely a racial conflict, Mr. Speaker. The truth is that there are some unacceptable examples of racism, but there are also unresolved negotiations because of a personal debate over livelihood. Indigenous livelihood, the well-being of those Canadians and their families, and the livelihood of many commercial fishers, Mr. Speaker. As the minister herself said, in her province, in Nova Scotia, it is part of the culture, Mr. Speaker. But she seems to have allowed this to just drag on to a point that it's now, we're seeing violence, and Canadians are concerned by that. So this is less in the way they're describing, and more about a failure to mediate and come to an agreement. And that's where leadership is needed. It's hard, Mr. Speaker, but that's what we've been asking for, the Conservatives, for months. It's made worse by the fact that in this pandemic, all families are worried about providing for their family. Indigenous, non-Indigenous. The government should have been knew that these tensions were rising. They could have shown leadership, but instead they're framing it as a tension that's brought on purely by racial elements, and that's not truly the case, Mr. Speaker. This is a dispute where constitutional fishery rights must be upheld for our Indigenous Canadians, and another where there's concern by commercial fishers, their union leaders, their community and civic leaders, that if this is not done right, conservation is not respected, that fishery, part of the culture, as the minister said, that's been taking place for centuries, could disappear, and many, many livelihoods and well-beings disappear. That's why we need to find a solution. That's why I raised it with the Prime Minister. That's why the member for West Nova has been raising it time and time again. We need to have both sides negotiate to find common ground in a mediated solution and long-term plan for the well-being of all Canadians, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. Rather than recognizing the impacts of inaction, this minister is preferring throw up her hands and agree with another political party that it's an emergency under her watch, Mr. Speaker. They'd rather have a debate here than bring people to the table there months ago, Mr. Speaker. And that's why Nova Scotians are watching, including my own family, Mr. Speaker, who are from Fall River, Nova Scotia, because this has gripped the entire region and country. It is harder to show leadership by showing a path to mediated long-term outcome. Instead, this government prefers more talk, press conferences with ministers, calling an emergency when they had 5 years. And for 4 of those years, Mr. Speaker, every single MP in that region was a Liberal MP. Instead of putting this as a priority, they were taking away the Atlantic Supreme Court justice, for example, until we stood up to that, Mr. Speaker. So going back in our history, as I've said to the Prime Minister before, who shows condescension every time I raise the issue of reconciliation, all governments in our history have not lived up to what we owe our Constitution and Indigenous Canadians. We are here to work on a solution if we can. We need less talk, less photo ops, less hashtags. We need real leadership that brings all communities together to find a solution. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Sydney, Victoria.
Yes, I'd like to thank the Leader of the Opposition for his comments. And I understand that he went to law school and graduated in 2003. I graduated myself in 2004 from that same law school. And while I was there, I was taught that there are 3 laws in Canada: the English common law, the French civil law, and Indigenous law. Now, I've heard some say that there can't be more than 1 law in Canada in the fisheries. I'm wondering if the Leader of the Opposition believes in legal pluralism or whether there can be more than 1 law in the fisheries. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I didn't know the member from Sydney, Victoria went to Dal Law. I'm very proud to go to Dalhousie Law School and to be a graduate. And what's interesting, Mr. Speaker, is that Donald Marshall himself, a victim of a miscarriage of our justice system, was failed by lawyers, judges, the whole Attorney General at the time in Nova Scotia, all of them Dalhousie Law graduates, and I know that member knows that, which is why we studied not only the Marshall wrongful conviction, but the 2 Marshall decisions related afterwards. Donald Marshall was caught fishing eels, Mr. Speaker, for a moderate livelihood. And he made that case all the way to the Supreme Court. The first decision of the Supreme Court was with respect to that Aboriginal right. Constitutional treaty in origin, we must respect that, it's important. The second decision was about the fact that the government can regulate for conservation and for the regulatory structure. That's why for 5 years they could have been finding a solution, Mr. Speaker, that would have respected our Constitution, would have respected the Indigenous right, which would have respected the local community and impact on the long-term viability of the fishery, and it would have respected the legacy of Donald Marshall, Mr. Speaker, which all Atlantic Canadians, all Dal Law grads certainly know and remember.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. Honorable député de Manicouagan.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I won't remind the Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition that it's not 5 years, but 21 years since the Marshall decision, so we've had time to see the Harper government, among others, in action. And I have a question, because in fact you'll understand that in my riding, 15% of the population is Indigenous. There are a lot of Innu and Naskapi communities in my riding, and they're very interested by what's going on. They have very numerous questions. One of them put forward by Martial Pichkenet. This is a question being asked to me repeatedly by several members. Why is the minister sending the RCMP? Why does he want to send the RCMP? Why doesn't he simply go and negotiate in Nova Scotia? So it's the First Nations themselves who are asking the question. I would like to hear the view of my honourable colleague with regard to this idea of sending in the RCMP instead of going there to negotiate, just as the Indigenous peoples are asking. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the question from the member from Manicouagan. It is true. The Marshall decision dates back 21 years, and as I stated in my statement, Mr. Speaker, several governments, Liberal and Conservative, made mistakes in the past. But today, after 5 years, after 4 years with all MPs in the Maritimes, all of the Maritime MPs, we don't have solutions for Indigenous peoples or for the rural communities in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. We need leadership. We must have leadership for a solution, Mr. Speaker. We must have a plan for the Indigenous communities and the other communities in Nova Scotia. We need a solution, and we have to obtain it at the negotiation table. And after 5 years, we're still waiting, Mr. Speaker. Same thing with all of the important issues. This government is always in waiting mode, and it's unacceptable, Mr. Speaker.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I would like to begin by denouncing the violence in my region in the southwest, in Bay Ste. Marie.
As I change, Mr. Speaker, everything that we've been seeing to date is happening in the riding of West Nova. And I wish I wasn't here tonight talking about this. I wish there would be a solution at hand that would have been brought forward days, months, years ago to solve the issue of moderate livelihood for our Indigenous people. But during that process, I would have thought along the way that there would have been some consultation with the people of West Nova whose lobster fishery is being affected by this. This has been happening for weeks. This has been happening for months. I wrote my first letter to the minister at least 2 months ago, underlining the issue that is before us. I've asked questions in the House. I've brought it up in my debate to speech and reply. Finally, now, when these threats have been thrown around, when the violence has gotten too much, finally, people seem interested in what's happening in West Nova. Where the heck were, where were you? Where were the other MPs? You'd think at some point I would have gotten a phone call from someone asking about what the situation really means. Now, what is causing the problem that we're seeing here in West Nova? I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that the people that I represent are scared. They're worried about what's happening in their communities. They're wondering what is going to happen next in their communities. Before I get to the current situation, I want to say to the minister and to the people that are speaking here today, please don't paint my area as racist. There's probably a few, as in many of our ridings. Systemic racism is true in Canada, but my area is not by default racist. It does not represent the majority of my citizens. Let's talk about where this starts. And I know I don't have enough time to talk about all the things that I really, really want to talk about of where this current situation is going. but the concern of an illegal fishery in St. Mary's Bay has been known by the DFO for many years, with some natives and some non-natives involved. It's just, we just need to look at the recent charging of Sheng Ren Zhang of China, who was charged for selling Indigenous lobsters in Nova Scotia back in August. Residents tell me in the constituency of Clare, or the community of Clare, that this is still going on. And the DFO and RCMP need to continue and make public the information from these investigations. That extra illegal activity has been affecting the local lobster stock by about 60%. The people of Clare are very worried about retaliation, and to date have been very quiet about this. But this is one of many points of discussion, not about the current situation of moderate livelihood. You know, the Marshall decision and the treaty rights are accepted by local fishers in the area. But as it will affect their livelihood, it should be discussed and consulted with them. That is at the base. Marshall 2 and the subsequent fisheries committee, the FOPO committee, led by the member from Malpeque at the time, was very expressive in including all participants in the discussions when we start to define what a moderate livelihood fishery actually is. You know, I guess the DFO needs to learn that consultation requires listening, not just talking, which is all they seem to do. Is I've heard it from the minister a number of times already. I've talked to fishers. She's made a couple of phone calls. She doesn't really understand what their concerns are, or at least it hasn't been shown that she knows what the core of this discussion really is. You know, I made a number of points in my letter about the Marshall decision, of what the Marshall decision is and what it isn't. And I thought I'd read probably the one point that's in here, but the letter is available on my website. First and foremost, the court claims that it did not hold that the Mi'kmaq Treaty
Suddenly, oh, we can't hear you. Would you mind checking to see if suddenly something happened? Seems like you've muted.
Yeah, that's weird. I'm sorry about that, sir.
There you go. Very good. Thank you.
So first and foremost, the court, I don't know where I left off, so I'll just read that whole line again. First and foremost, the court claims that it did not hold that the Mi'kmaq Treaty right could not be regulated, nor that the Mi'kmaq were guaranteed an open season in the fisheries. It's paragraph 2 of the Marshall decision. The court emphasized that the treaty right had always been subject to regulation, and the government's power to regulate the treaty right had been repeatedly affirmed in the September 17th, 1999 majority judgment. That's paragraph 24 of the Marshall decision. There's a number of suggestions of what the Marshall decision is and what the Marshall decision isn't. And I can tell you that most fishers that I talk to, most associations that I talk to, accept the decision of Marshall 2 and look forward to negotiation, discussions, and consultation when it comes to this issue. I also hear from the minister, and I know I'm getting closer to the end of my time, about nation-to-nation negotiation, and that there is no seat for commercial fishers at the table. Okay, I'm okay with that. I think commercial fishermen are okay with that as well. But in most negotiations, there's always a second consultation table where experts sit so that you can go back and say, okay, well, this is what we're thinking. This is not what we're thinking. As a matter of fact, in the recent negotiation with the United States, nation to nation, on NAFTA, we know that Jerry Diaz was sitting at the table with negotiators representing workers. So, Mr. Speaker, my workers, the fishermen, the fishing community that is the base of all of our economic activity in West Nova would just want to be able to sit at the table, to be able to be part of that negotiation, and, Mr. Speaker, to be able to provide a moderate livelihood for their families as well. There's tensions on all sides. Not everyone is subject to this, but I've seen threats from all sides. Tensions need to be brought down. I spend my days talking to fishermen and telling them to stand down while negotiations are ongoing. I'm quite honestly getting very tired of it. And I just ask for everyone's help to continue to bring down this pressure. This morning at a rally in Barrington, the previous Minister of Fisheries in Nova Scotia, Sterling Beliveau, said something important that does worry me. And he says, if you're not at the table, Mr. Speaker, you're on the menu. And my fishers are really worried today that because they're not being consulted, they're not at the table talking about things, that their industry is on the menu. With those short words, I thank you for your attention on that. I'm looking forward to getting all these calls from my colleagues wondering what's going on in the fishery in Southwest Nova Scotia. But I need the minister to step up. I need her to be here on the ground. I need her to meet with fishermen, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous as well. Matter of fact, I've got a truck. I'd be more than happy to drive up and pick her up and drive her down and keep her safe while we have these discussions as well. With that, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Member for Kings Hants.
Thank my honourable colleague from West Nova for his remarks today. Before I get to my question, I do want to highlight the fact that although we would never condone what we've seen in terms of the violence, and I would join those that have already condemned that type of behaviour, I don't think it is reflective of the entire industry, and I think that those were important remarks to be made. My question is, the member opposite referenced an illegal fishery. As you know, Mr. Speaker, and as other parliamentarians may know, I represent Sibäganägäti, the First Nation at the heart of this community. I do not see this as an illegal fishery. It may be unauthorized, but the Supreme Court says that the right exists. Will the member from West Nova acknowledge that the fishing activities that Sibäganägäti is conducting right now is not illegal?
I thank the member for the question. There we go. I agree with the member that it isn't an unauthorized fishery that's going on with Sibäganägäti, but there is an illegal fishery going on in St. Mary's Bay. In the background, underneath the ocean, there are thousands of traps. There are lots of lobsters being sold for cash. This is a well-known issue in the area of Clare and something that DFO needs to seriously look into and rectify. And the community, I think, would be more at ease